All right.
Thank you, Sam. We know that the board members are here with audio and video, so we're good there. I'm going to call the meeting to order. First item on the agenda tonight is the approval of the May 13th training session meetings from our virtual meeting. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I so move.
Thank you, Dan. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Without objection, minutes are approved. We only got two things to talk about tonight, and we're going to switch A and B from the original agenda that was put out because we got Andrew Wilson with us tonight to help out on some of this. While we can't discuss the cases that we heard at our last regular BZA meeting, I want to thank all of you. That was quite an ordeal and probably one of the longest meetings we ever had. That meeting ended at 9:08 p.m. And what prompted this training session was that 18 minutes later, my internet went out. And that brought up the point of what are we going to do if we end up with a technology failure for any one of the members? How are we going to maintain a quorum? What should we do in terms of audio, video, that sort of thing, and a restoration of the internet connection to get you back into the meeting so that we can hopefully continue it without having to postpone it and start all over. So with having said that, Andrew, are you online?
I am here.
Could you give us some input on that, please?
Yeah, I think one recommendation that I would make would be to have contact information for the host. So I think for this group, it would be Sam. So if you do lose connection, that you can reach out to him or whoever is hosting the meeting to let them know that you are having trouble connecting. That would be recommendation number one. My other recommendation that goes along with that is that there is a participant ID number that goes along with the reminder email and then the webinar email, the panelist email rather, where it will give you a phone number that you can call into. You can put in the webinar code and the participant ID number, and you can connect back in via phone. So if your internet went down, but you still had phone service, oh yeah, great. And actually this message doesn't show it shows the webinar ID, but it doesn't show the participant ID. The hosts don't have participant IDs, we discovered today. But everybody else here should have that as a fallback. So what I would recommend is that when you get that initial panelist email a week or two before the meeting, maybe write down the first phone number that's listed there, on a Post-it note or something, and the webinar ID and the participant ID. So then you have something to fall back on if you don't have access to your email or the internet. Does that make sense to everybody?
I think so. Isn't it just a phone? There's a phone number on the thing you sent us, Andrew. It says joined by your computer or joined by phone. And then you call a 301 number or a 312 number or a bunch of. Okay.
They have different options. They have different phone numbers, which I know that those emails are a little confusing. The assistant city manager and I have been talking about that and hoping that Zoom will give us more control over what those emails look like in the future. So they give you a series of numbers to call. So I'm not exactly sure why they have so many listed. I suspect that they can only take in so many callers per number. So if they would get flooded in one number, you could call another.
Okay. Andrew, what about this? I think everybody's carrying smartphones these days. How about hotspotting our phone and reconnecting that way? Would that be an option?
Yeah.
I keep mine right here just in case.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, as long you can connect via any data connection, as long as you have the camera and mic on the a machine, whether or not it's a computer or a smartphone or a tablet. It doesn't matter if the data connection is a cable modem or a data plan from a cell phone. It may be a little easier for a lot of people to connect through the cell phone rather than a computer. So,
Well, that's what I was thinking. Roger, I think you said you've got some experience using hotspot. So we know that
I've
Roger's
used
got,
it all over the country. As long as you've got cell connection, you've got, and it's secure. So as long as you got cell connection, you've got secure internet.
okay. Kate, do you have the ability to hotspot your phone if needed?
Kate, you're muted.
I could Zoom. I don't know what hotspot means. I could Zoom on my phone or I could call on my phone.
Well, probably the easiest way to get the instruction on how to hotspot would be to call your cell carrier
Okay.
on their customer support, and they'll walk you through it. Basically, it's creating another means of access using your phone as basically a router, and it can be turned off and on. So your cell carrier is going to be able to explain that better than I would.
I got it. Yeah, I know that concept. Okay.
Okay. Chris Allison,
Literally, it's right here in your settings on any smartphone.
Oh, yeah. In
You've
the
got
set.
a personal hotspot and just you can punch it on.
That
Then
is
when you
dependent
set
on your data plan,
computer up,
though.
You put the ID of the hotspot in your computer and save it. And then anytime you turn your hotspot on your computer, it'll automatically pick up onto that.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
That is a feature of a data plan. So I know that on certain providers, it comes default, like on my Verizon plan, it's something that came with my plan, but not everybody has a data plan, but maybe everybody here at BZA does. Does that make sense?
It does, and actually, you'd have to probably check with your cell provider to check your plan and check the availability. So,
Yes.
Chris Allison, do you have the ability to hotspot your phone if needed?
I do.
Sounds good. Dan Hazeman, how about you?
I don't know. I wouldn't know how to do. I'm like Kate. I wouldn't know how to do that. I have a Verizon phone, but I'm looking now and I don't see.
Can you get
I
on
don't
the
see
internet
that.
with it, Dan?
You go to
connect.
setting. There's something in settings that might show it. That's what I got. Mine can do it.
iPhone.
Okay. Well, Dan, get hold of Verizon. As you get an opportunity, I think their customer service is star 611, and they'll walk you through it.
Okay.
Okay. Now that takes care of BZA. You know, Ben Mazer, are you online? Do you have the same capabilities?
I do, and once we're done talking about the technological aspect of this, I can also address the legal aspect if you would like, what to do legally to ensure that we're still compliant with Ohio laws if we lose a member. So just let me know when you would like me to do that, if now or later, I'm happy to do that.
I just want to kind of get the technical aspect of it out of the way, and then we'll get it over to you, and you can walk us through the rest of it.
Certainly, I appreciate that. I do have the ability. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Finally, what happens if we lose a host, Sam?
We do have co-hosting abilities, so if there's more than one staff member, then it should be able to continue. We also have a setting when the webinar is first set up where you can enable panelists to join without having the host. So the downside to that is that the broadcast won't actually be started. So, but once the broadcast is started, it should continue even if the host drops out. But we should have 2 staff members, so I don't think that will cause a problem.
Okay. Sam, generally, when you're hosting these, are you at the city building?
Generally, yes.
Okay, so I think you made a comment when we were talking one time about city council had a member that lost connection and you had to bring them up and use one of the workstations up there in the city building.
Yes.
So worst case scenario, would that be a possibility also?
Yes. We would want to have the cell phone numbers probably shared amongst everybody. Obviously we wouldn't do that right here on this meeting, but so that everyone can communicate if necessary, just for the purposes of restoring that quorum or attendance.
Okay, well, along that lines, board members, as you get the opportunity, email Sam and get him your contact information, including your cell phone, so that he has that as a backup on our per need basis. Anybody else want to add anything on the technical aspect of it before I turn it over to Ben?
Yes, I would like to.
Yes, sir.
So another thing that you should do if you have an Android phone or an iPhone or an iPad, install the Zoom app on the mobile device. Just go ahead and install it now, even if you're not using it. And before each meeting, check for updates through the App Store or the Google Play Store, just to make sure you're on the latest app. So that would help in the future if you do lose power and you have to get it on your cell phone.
Good suggestion. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, Ben, we're going to turn this over to you and let you walk. Sorry,
Christopher Allison raised his hand.
I had
didn't see him.
if my Wi-Fi is out at home and I wanted to go to McDonald's and use the Wi-Fi there, is that okay?
Yeah.
It's my understanding that Zoom encrypts everything, so I'm not going to have problems.
I would
As long as-
recommend having headphones if you're going to do that, because then it cuts down on the background noise. And get the headphones with the built-in microphone.
Okay.
Okay, good thought. Thanks, Chris. Anybody else? Ben, it's up to you.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I didn't say that before I started speaking the last time, but good evening. So the big question is going to be, from a legal perspective, if we lose a member of the BZA, whether or not we still have a quorum enabling us to move forward with that individual no longer participating. So if we still have a quorum, if we have a sufficient number of BZA members still participating, still connected and able to vote, then we do have the ability, at least legally speaking, to move forward without that BZA member who dropped off. The caveat is it presents a little bit of a disadvantage for the applicant, because you have one BZA member who is not going to be voting. So you basically lose the vote of one BZA member. So the applicant may prefer for us to take a break to try to reestablish the connection of the BZA member who we lost. That would probably be the most preferable approach, to try to get that individual back online before we move forward, because really the loss of a BZA member is almost the same as a no vote. However, if we're not able to bring that BZA member back online, and if the applicant is willing to move forward without that BZA member, assuming we still have a quorum, we can legally proceed. We should offer the applicant the opportunity to request a continuance if the applicant wishes to do so, whether we have maintained a quorum or not, because of the disadvantage that the applicant has without having that additional vote. The flip side of that coin is, what if we don't have a quorum with the loss of that BZA member? And the answer to that is we cannot proceed. We cannot proceed if we don't have a quorum. So under those circumstances, we would want to offer the applicants, we really don't have a choice. We would have to continue the hearing to a future date to ensure that we have a quorum in order to proceed. We do typically want to have that request for a continuance come from the applicant if possible, but certainly without a quorum, we cannot proceed, and there's really no other choice. And a really important thing to bring up, and this actually came up in City Council last night where I was, we had similar issues with one of the counselors and their connectivity. That counselor was not able to participate. And the question came up of whether or not that individual could have somebody else vote for them. In other words, have a proxy vote. And the answer to that with council and with the BZA is proxy votes are prohibited. So I want to be clear about the fact, unfortunately, under Ohio law, an individual that is not able to actually cast their votes, either in person or virtually, like we're all here tonight virtually, they cannot pass their vote on to another BZA member to vote on their behalf, even if they're texting or they're communicating by email or some other way. Proxy votes are not permitted. They're prohibited. And that's all I have on that. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Board members?
I have a question, Ben. I understand the proxy thing, but if you're on the phone, like when are you virtually there? If you're on a Zoom meeting or if you're on the phone, but not if you're texting?
That's correct. So, if the member, I would say if the member is able to call in and voice their votes, even if we don't have a video of that individual, I think that's just fine. The difference is, of course, with texting, you have another counselor or board member relaying or conveying that text that they have in their phone on that other board member's behalf, and that's going to be a violation of the Sunshine Law. So, hopefully that answers the question.
Sure. So a phone call would work. Okay.
I believe that would suffice. Yep, as long as we have that board member actually voicing their votes for themselves on the phone, even if we don't have a visual with, their face and picture, I think that's just fine.
Okay. Good.
Anybody else? Ben, we were talking about board members, but what happens if we have an interruption in testimony or we lose staff or appellant after testimony and we're in discussion? Can we continue? Because what we generally do is after we hear testimony from staff and from the appellant, we ask if anybody else is going to testify, and if not, we close that, reconvene to a regular session. We then have discussion and a vote. If we lose, let's say that we lose the appellant during their testimony, should we follow the same procedures as if we lost quorum?
I believe that'd be the best practice. I do, because I think, you really need to have that applicant there to address any questions or concerns that come up. And you want to have a complete record. So everything that you're doing as the BZA is always considering the possibility that that applicant could potentially be dissatisfied with whatever conclusion the BZA reaches, and potentially appeal that decision through a 2506 appeal to the Court of Common Pleas. So you as the BZA, you want to strive to have a complete record. You want to ensure that the applicant is there and able to address questions and provide their testimony if that is their decision to do so. Under those circumstances, if you lose the applicant, I believe it would be best practice to adjourn the hearing and to continue it to a future date. And that's as it relates specifically to the applicant.
Okay. After testimony by staff and applicant, and we've reconvened to a regular session for discussion, if we lose the applicant at that point, can we continue with our discussion and vote?
That's a closer call, I think, and that's a tough one. And I would say, from a legal standpoint, I would feel more comfortable with that because if you're no longer going to have an open comment session for the public or for the applicant, they've had the opportunity. It's been closed, and they've had the opportunity to speak and testify. I don't believe that there's any additional evidence or testimony that's going to come into the record, and you probably could proceed without the applicant at that point. I think really the crucial inquiry from my perspective, at least, is whether or not that applicant has had their ability to testify to the full extent that they desire to and that they're able to under the law and under BZA procedures.
Okay, thank you. Any other members have anything?
Yes, I have one.
Yes, sir.
If we lose the broadcast or the recording, can we continue?
Ben, I think that question's for you.
Sure. Yeah, if this is a public hearing, so I think, my perception of that is that it needs to be available to the public in some fashion or another. So if we're having technical difficulties where we cannot publish to the public, it's no longer really an open meeting from my perspective. And we would want to adjourn so that we can satisfy open meeting law and sunshine laws.
Thank you.
Yeah, staff is monitoring that while the host is typically monitoring that while it's going on. So we would report any problems with that during the meeting.
Great. Okay. Well, Ben, let me ask you this. It obviously takes a little bit of time to try to reestablish a connection, get somebody onto a hotspot, or perhaps to the city building for a workstation. What is a reasonable amount of time before we have to adjourn the session and postpone to a future date? Are we talking 10 minutes, 20 minutes?
Really, it's what you believe is reasonable as the BZA. It's a very subjective standard in that sense. So I don't think there's a really hard, fast rule about what's objective under those circumstances. But I think whatever you deem to be reasonable, I think probably 10 minutes is certainly reasonable. 20 minutes, I think at that point it could be reasonable. But I think that's a judgment call that the BZA can make, and I don't think there's really a wrong answer to that. Certainly, you reach a certain period of time that's probably no longer going to be reasonable. Probably, an hour is not reasonable.
Yeah.
But it's a judgment call, and I don't think there's necessarily a wrong answer per se. But it's really going to be dictated by the circumstances. Certainly, if you have a full agenda for a particular night, you may have 4 or 5 different cases that you want to hear. In the case that you lose an applicant for one case, you probably don't want to adjourn for too long because you want to get to the rest of the agenda and the other cases on your schedule. So it's just going to be dictated by the circumstances, and it's going to be a judgment call for the BZA.
I think the 10-minute is probably a pretty good idea. We want to be prompt. We want to give the people an opportunity to testify, hear the case, decide on the case, and 10 minutes on hold, basically, with mute and perhaps no video is a long time. Which kind of segues into my next question for you. During an outage, we lose a board member or an applicant or whatever. What should the board members do? Mute and then turn off the video?
I don't think there's any requirement to necessarily mute or turn off the video. Actually, I would. We remain in public in a public hearing even during that time. So I think my recommendation would be certainly if we're going offline to try to contact that individual and help them get back on. I think there's the ability to mute, but I think preferably everybody keeps their video screen on and remains in public session, including your audio. Because we do remain in public hearing. However, if somebody needs to step out to try to assist that person, to try to bring them back online, I think that's acceptable to do so. But otherwise, I think everybody just kind of remains in a holding pattern and does remain in public hearing and tries to keep your video on and your audio on.
That's fine. Obviously, we can't proceed any further with the meeting until we get that person or persons restored. So the comment to the board members would, even though everything is live, don't say anything, don't discuss it. You're on hold, literally, until we get this thing back online.
I certainly agree with that. So we definitely don't want to have a substantive discussion about the matter that's before the BZA without that other BZA member. With the caveat being, if we do decide, of course, to proceed because we still have a quorum and the applicant is agreeable to that, then of course the BZA proceedings may continue at that point.
Great, thanks. Anybody have any other questions or comments? Sam?
I was just going to say, I think the logical step then would be to call a recess. So that starts the hold essentially until the recess is ended. So whoever the chair or vice chair, whoever's presiding that night would make that call. Is that right?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, I think we covered that. Ben, Sam, Andrew, thanks for your input. I hope we never have to make use of that information, but it's great to have it. And reminder, everybody, get your contact information to Sam privately. Okay. We've got one other thing on the agenda for tonight, and that's transitioning from discussion to a motion. We reconvene into a regular session after testimony, and then it's an open discussion between the board members. One thing that I want to do, especially with our newer members, is to have you comfortable enough and knowledgeable enough that you're willing and able to make a motion and then base it on the Duncan standards. We've gone through things in the past with work sessions talking about what board members can and cannot do, and we discussed the Duncan standards. But Ben, could you give us a little bit of a heads up here on how to make that move, and then how we should make the motion? And I'll explain that as we get to the point of the motion, because it's going to be different, I feel, if we have a potential for approving a variance versus denying a variance. So with that in mind, if you could kind of steer us from discussion to motion, Ben.
Absolutely. Really, the first piece of that I'm going to address is, really whether or not prior to making the motion, there needs to be a full discussion as to each of the individual Duncan standards when you're considering whether or not to grant the variance. So as it relates to a discussion of the Duncan standards individually, really that's going to be fact specific or dependent upon the particular case that you're looking at and considering. For decisions that are a little bit more controversial, or a little bit that seem to be a little bit more less of a consensus amongst the BZA members, there's more matters in dispute. Those are circumstances under which the BZA may wish to have a full discussion of each of the individual Duncan standards and see where each of the BZA members come out on the individual Duncan standards. Certain decisions that the BZA is going to make, it may be obvious, or likely will be obvious from the case that there's perhaps more consensus amongst the BZA as to whether or not a variance is going to be granted, and under those circumstances, it may not be necessary to go through each individual Duncan standard. The main consideration that the BZA should have when deciding whether or not to go individually through each Duncan standard is potentially whether or not there's going to be the need to have a complete record for a potential appeal, a 2506 appeal from the applicant. And of course, there's no way to know for certain, but certainly, as the BZA knows, somebody that is not happy with the decision the BZA reaches, that aggrieved party, that applicant, can elect to appeal the BZA's decision through a 2506 appeal to the Court of Common Pleas. And under those circumstances, as the BZA, if they're challenging the decision you reached, you want to make sure that we do have a complete record, and that the more evidence on the record, or more testimony on the record by the BZA as it relates to each of those individual Duncan standards, the better. So it's a little bit of a judgment call. From staff's perspective, probably under most circumstances or most situations, there probably will be the need for the BZA to go through each individual Duncan standards. So that may end up being the norm, that may be the majority of the cases, but there could certainly foreseeably be cases where that's not necessary, in which case rather, the BZA is not necessarily required to go individually through each Duncan standard. As it relates to making a motion, once it's time for a BZA member to make a motion, once it's clear that the evidence has been presented and the discussion is had, it's going to depend, of course, upon whether or not it's a motion to adopt the recommendations of staff and approve the variance with or without additional conditions that the BZA wants to impose upon the variance. So, for example, if it's a motion simply to adopt the recommendations of staff and approve the variance, the BZA member can say, I would like to make a motion to adopt the recommendations of staff and approve the variance. Likewise, if it's a motion to approve the variance as recommended by staff with some conditions that the BZA wishes to impose, the motion would again be a motion to approve the variance as recommended by staff with the following conditions. So the motion would include the fact that you would like to suggest some additional conditions on that variance. Additionally, the BZA could make a motion, a BZA member could make a motion to approve a variance with or without conditions as we discussed, or a motion, of course, to deny the variance if that's the motion that the BZA wishes to make. So it's going to be dependent upon whether or not the BZA wishes to make a motion in approval of the variance, and also whether or not the BZA wishes to suggest additional conditions on that variance. Happy to answer any questions.
Board
Thank you.
members? Nobody has anything?
I have a couple, Mike.
Go ahead.
Okay, so the aggrieved party, can that be a citizen who has standing and made testimony? Okay.
The key is that it needs to be somebody that has standing. So you're absolutely right about that. Somebody that testifies just because they testify does not necessarily have standing. So it needs to be somebody that that has standing to file the appeal of the BZA decision.
Okay. The second one is when we're talking about conditions. Oh, I'm sorry. If we have a discussion on the motion for variance, Duncan standards. Obviously, as we go through it, some people might make notes on their copy of the Duncan standards in preparation of making a motion or whatever it might happen to be. Are those part of the record that need to be turned in?
I think that ends up becoming a public records question. Certainly, I believe that would be a public record, and under public records law, that could be something that is required to be turned over if somebody requests it. I would encourage BZA members to maintain any records that are created by them, or and certainly, staff obviously has the records, the public records related to the application and the staff's report. But I think it is beneficial, certainly, if you make notes, if you fill out one of these cheat sheets, if you will, that we have here on the screen right now. I would maintain those, and because I believe it does become a public record.
Okay, so we can each individually maintain ours.
Or, I would defer to Sam, but I think certainly, I guess those could be provided to the city, to staff, as well as perhaps part of the file itself, the application itself. But certainly, if you're doing anything as a part of your duties as a BZA member, if this is something that is influential in your decision, it could become a public record. I don't want to say for certain, but I think there's the potential.
Okay, Sam, any comment?
I guess my only comment is, just because we've never retained those records before doesn't mean that, if somebody did file a 2506 and there was discovery process, we would, I'll be honest with you, BZA members are typically named, at least the chairperson is, and, it could be possible that, that they would want to get those records, but I would, I would prefer that you just hold on to them during your term, and not turn them over to us unless requested. And
Okay,
probably just leave it at that. I'm not concerned about it. They've never, to my knowledge, been requested before. But that's a really good question.
It is a good question. And early on in my tenure, I was cautioned about trying to maintain a separate email address for my work with BZA, because if they requested it and I've got it in another in folder, they could take all of that, a copy of it, and sift through it. But as Sam said, we've never had a request for those records, and I wouldn't be overly concerned about it. If you want to keep your cheat sheets, keep a folder at home, keep them in there. But it's kind of a non-issue. I've never heard of anybody requesting work product from a BZA member when they did a 2506. So maybe a good idea to keep it, but I wouldn't be overly concerned about it.
okay,
Yeah, I think the difference there, the kind of the litmus test is it doesn't rise to the level of testimony and evidence because it wasn't shared with everyone. So while yes, maybe an attorney could request it in discovery, it could probably be disputed. So I think I agree with Mike. It's probably an issue.
all right. And one last question.
Yes, sir.
On the handouts, we got chapter 1139 variants.
Mhm.
On section 1, C1, it talks about a variance shall be valid only for the specific use, site location, and provision, blah, blah, blah. Now, is it okay if I talk about a specific location in Oxford that has not come before the BZA, to my knowledge?
No,
Okay,
no. We're dealing with the application at hand for that property, for that purpose. And unless they want,
I understand. I'm for the purpose of asking this question, is it okay for me to just pick a random example?
Ben, you can take it if you want, but it's my understanding that no, we can't bring in information from another property. Is that right, Ben?
I would concur with what you said, and I would also, welcome Sam's input on that as well. But I would certainly concur with what you said from my perspective.
Okay. What I'm trying to
This is
understand is if we give a variance for a specific, if someone comes before us and says, hey, I want to build a greenhouse in my backyard, and it's too close to the property line, but because it's a greenhouse, we say, sure, go ahead. If they then turn around and built a shed, several years later, is that a change of use that would nullify the variance?
Yes.
We typically handle all those things at the staff level. Fortunately, you don't have to worry about that.
Okay.
But in general, yes, that's a change, but we typically would not enforce it to that degree unless it was larger or taller or in some way different in bulk. A different material, probably not. A different size, probably.
Okay. Okay.
Or if there was a different level of impact from it, like different external effects that would be created that might push it over the limit.
Would that be, if we were concerned about that, would that be grounds for doing a condition?
Certainly,
Mm-hmm.
certainly. We had a case probably 3 years ago with I'm not sure what I want to call it, a pharmacy, but they're on Spring Street with the vitamin store that there was some controversy that the person wanted to put a sign up in the parking lot with a penetration of the paving. And what we did is we said, we're going to let you go ahead and grant the variance, but it's a temporary sign. In other words, there's a frame underneath it. There's no penetration of the blacktop. And when they vacate the property, they can very easily pick it up and take it out with them. So that was a condition that we added to that variance, and the person got their sign, and we maintain parking in the future if they ever vacate it. So yes, conditions are absolutely acceptable
Okay,
as long as they're reasonable.
okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody else? Okay, well,
Wait a minute, wait a minute, sorry, I got a question, sorry, forgot. to-
okay, go ahead.
It's the issue of substantial, what it means to be substantial. That was a question I wrote somewhere in our last debate, I think. So how do we define what substantial is? Do we rely on the staff to tell us what is substantial? Sam knows the answer.
Sam, do you know the answer?
Well, I give you my answer, but you may not agree with it in a hearing. So the staff's answer in that particular Duncan standard, we usually tie it to some kind of bulk mathematical calculation. A lot of times when the variance requested is greater than 50% of what the zoning code would allow, we will put it in this substantial category. But it's not a black and white 50%, because in some cases, if the height of the building is really out of character for the area, the impact of having it 10% closer could be a lot greater to the neighbor. So it's not always, a hard and fast rule. So we try to juggle all of that together to give you what our interpretation is of that particular case. And our staff report reads basically on what we know at the time. Yeah, someone that is a neighbor might present additional information that alters that perspective. So it's important for you to weigh all of that when you're determining whether something is substantial or not. But that's a good question, because that criteria or that standard is usually referenced in every case.
Kate, did that answer your question?
I think so. I mean, so it's okay to rely on the staff recommendations, but also on the other information that comes through. Okay. So there's no set number of what is substantial, and that's just part of our deliberation. Okay, yeah, I got it.
And your own personal perspective is certainly included in that. What is substantial to one person is not necessarily substantial to another. So, don't be afraid to put your own values and ideas in on that.
Okay. Good.
Anybody else?
Thanks.
Okay. One thing that I'd like to talk about is that we're going through the Duncan standards, and we had a rather laborious meeting, and I'd like to avoid what I did in going through standard by standard. When we get into discussion, I'd kind of like to have it like we're doing now. I think we've got a pretty good crew where we don't talk over top of one another. And if we do, we yield very readily so that it's easy to transcribe. It'd just be a lot easier and take a lot less time if we could do it just about like what we're doing right now. But when it gets to the point of a contentious case, then I agree. We do need to spend the additional time and go down standard by standard and get a consensus from the board. Ben, is that acceptable to you?
Absolutely, I concur with that.
Okay. All right. Now, as we get into the actual motion, as you said, we may just touch on them if we're going to have an approval of a variance. We could still have an aggrieved party withstanding do a 2506, but we can also get hit by lightning or hit the lottery. If we're into a controversial case, then it's going to have to be section by section, standard by standard to get through that. And I think that's very important that the court has that information so that they can understand where we were coming from in our decision process. That's going to take some time. That's going to be a little bit laborious, especially in a virtual meeting, but I appreciate you bearing with us on that. So, Ben, you want to add anything?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's absolutely right.
Okay. Then, as entertaining as our sample cases are, I think we could go through those individually. Does anybody have anything that they want to add to this? Okay, all quiet. Whoops. Mine just went
Broke
to
down
Zoom.
in Sleepyville, South Dakota.
Okay. Motion to adjourn,
So moved.
second,
Second.
without objection.
All right.
The meeting is adjourned. Thank you for participating, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
We think we'll have a meeting in July, we think, yeah?
We will.
Okay,
Yes.
well, got it.
Sounds
See you
good.
then. All right.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.